Go. We've done this before. We know what to expect, a week of meetings, and that's it. But with God, you can never say, here we go, I know what to expect. Because God can always surprise us. And I want to share with you an experience today, something that happened to me some time ago, where God totally surprised me. When I look at the Bible, I love to read the Gospels. I love to look at the life of Jesus and what he did, what he said, and the impact that he made on the lives of those around him. And one of the things that fascinates me more than anything else when I read the Gospels is how Jesus was able to take any stone-dead situation and turn it into a cause for celebration. And so today, I want us to think about that. I want us to be reminded of that Jesus can still take those situations that cause us to feel as if we're in lockdown, and he can do something about them. And so this morning, I'm not going to preach. I'm just going to tell you how God solved a stone-dead situation in my life in a way in which I would never imagine. But before I do that, I want to ask you a couple of questions. Have you ever felt confused about God? Confused about the way he is working in your life? Have you ever wondered whether God really cares for you? Because if he did, he would not let the things that are happening to you in your life take place. Have you ever felt the forgotten one in God's family? Others seem to be blessed with one good thing, one after another, but your life seems to be so full of pauses and full stops that at times you feel crushed, stockpiled beneath them. I have. In 2013, I was diagnosed with a gallstone. It was a health challenge that caused me to take a step backwards in my relationship with God. As you know, I have a condition called ankylosing spondylitis and also a lung problem called bronchiectasis. Both are incurable. They will never get better. They will just keep getting worse. And so it was too much for me to have a third health problem. And even though on the outside I acted as if nothing was wrong, inside I was falling apart. I would read verses like 1 Corinthians 10 verse 13, which says that he will not let you be tempted beyond which you can bear. And I would say, God, how can these words be true? Because this is too much for me to bear. I felt that God had gone too far. He had given me something that I couldn't handle. But it wasn't until later that I realized that I was never meant to handle it because God wanted to handle it for me. Now, for most people, having a gallstone or gallstones is no big deal. There are many who walk around oblivious to them within their body, and for those who experience the pain, just an operation to remove the gallbladder is all that is needed. But not for me. With the growth of my gallstone came the growth of my fear. An operation for me carried the possibility, the very real possibility, that I could die, because that's what I had been told. 3 times I had been refused anesthetic by different consultants. One when I was actually being wheeled into the theatre on a trolley. Another time a consultant looked at the lack of movement in my neck, looked at my medical records, shook his head and walked away. And so I ended up having one procedure by sedation and another by an epidural. The consultants knew that the risk of me not recovering from an anesthetic was of more concern than any operation I might need. The word, "it is a problem," had been said to me so many times that they were firmly embedded within my heart and within my mind. It is a problem. And so my gallstone and I lived with each other, not happily, but we learnt to tolerate one another. I stayed away from as much oil and fat as I could, which is a great way to diet, ladies, if you ever want to do that, so as to not agitate my gallstone, and my gallstone remained a silent resident. But something else took up residency within me, and that was anger. It doesn't seem right to say that I was angry with God because God has done so much for me in my life, but that's what I felt. Angry because there were no more afternoon teas with yummy cakes when I felt stressed, or chips on a Saturday night when I was tired, or going out with friends and just ordering what I wanted. I hated the restrictions. And I hated those restrictions because with my other health conditions, I am restricted. I have to spend at least 2 or 3 hours a day to exercise in order to be able to hold back those illnesses taking control. And so when I ended up with a gallstone and I was told, no, you can't do something else, I hated it. And I hated what God has declared permissible in my life. I also began to feel really anxious. Despite all the Bible verses telling me that God knew what was best for me, and despite all the amazing things that God has done for me in the past, I feared an operation. And one day when I was at complete breaking point, I cried out to God to do something about that gallstone because I couldn't keep living with the effect it was having on me. But I didn't expect God to answer my cry in the way in which he did. About 2 years ago, I was selected to go as a delegate to the General Conference session in San Antonio. Now that decision confused me. Why, with all my health issues, which the conference knows about, out of a conference of 98 pastors, would I be the only pastor chosen to go? Because it made no sense to me, I accepted the invitation, thinking that the BUC or the TED would block it. Surely it was a mistake that I had been selected, but it wasn't blocked. I figured then that God was behind it. I checked with my consultants, and I was assured that I had nothing to worry about. The gallstone had lived with me as quietly as a mouse within a house, and so no one expected any problems. If for some reason, whilst in the States, the situation would change, I would just be given a course of antibiotics. There would be no need to fear an operation in the States because there would be no need of one. However, a few months before I was due to fly out for the session, I began to experience pain in my back. In fact, the pain was such that it would wake me up at night. No one linked it to the gallbladder. I also began to feel unwell, and even though I worked and I did everything that I needed to do, I felt so ill that I decided that my trip to the GC would be the last thing I would do as a pastor. I would resign on my return. I later found out that I felt so ill because of the gallbladder. On Monday, the 29th of June, we flew out to Charlottesville. We figured we'd spend a few days there en route to San Antonio. On that flight, I had pain. Not severe pain, but enough to know that something wasn't right. By the time we arrived at San Antonio on the Wednesday, I was weak. I had no energy. I was shivering. My pain had increased. We planned to see the local doctor the next day, and in the morning, God gave me a hint that he was going to do something extraordinary. Now, I had been dutifully reading my Sabbath school lessons as we do for my morning worships. However, a little time before this, I had felt impressed not to continue, but to read the book of Jeremiah instead. And that particular morning, I had reached chapter 30. And verse 12 of chapter 30 reads like this: "Your wound is incurable, your injury beyond healing." Yes, I said to God, I know that my wounds are incurable. You don't have to tell me. But then I read in verse 17, "But I will restore you to health and heal your wounds, declares the Lord." Oh Lord, I prayed, I know that you will heal me in your kingdom to come, but actually I feel so ill now, I could do with your help. A trip to the doctor had reassured me that God had answered my prayers, or so I thought. He said that I didn't have the typical signs, the typical symptoms of a gallbladder attack, so he thought I just had a viral infection. He gave me some antibiotics to take as a preventative measure. I thanked the doctor, thanked God, clutched my prescription, and looked forward to attending the GC and making my little speech, if I got a chance, regards women's ordination. However, Sabbath morning, the 4th of July, my sister-in-law Mandy and her husband, who had planned some months before to join us, travelled from Florida, and they took Jonathan and I to the hospital. Incidentally, Mandy is a nurse practitioner, and even though it was always her practice to attend the GC session at the end of the week, she felt impressed that she had to come at the beginning for the very first weekend. She stayed with me in the hospital, supervising, checking everything until I was to be discharged. And if I were to die, knowing that Jonathan's sister was with him gave me comfort. And because of her friendship with Ted Wilson's daughter, the president of the GC, I was actually prayed for that morning at the church service. Anyway, after several tests and a CT scan, we were shocked to learn that my gallbladder was so infected or inflamed that it had to come out within 24 hours. Sitting on my bed, I began to cry. Jonathan put an arm around me and said to the doctors, no, you can't operate on my wife. There are problems. I will take her back to England immediately. She is under the care of 2 professors at one of the major London hospitals. If she has to have an operation, it has to be with them, under their team. No, came the reply. The wall of the gallbladder was so thick, they said, that they couldn't let me out of the hospital, and no way could I go on a plane. The gallbladder could burst at any time. In fact, they feared that whilst removing the gallbladder, it would actually fall apart. They later discovered that it had stuck to my intestine, and the stone, which was large, was pressing on the wall of my stomach. As I cried, I talked silently with God. Why, God? Why here? Why did you bring me here to die without even being able to say goodbye to my daughters? Why? Why here? Please don't let Jonathan have to take me home in a casket. Jonathan kept protesting and listing the problems. My wife's neck does not tilt. You will not be able to put her under anesthetic. No problem, came the reply. We have a special instrument here for those who cannot tilt their necks. But her ribs, they do not move. Her lungs will not be able to fully expand after the operation, and one of her lungs is partially collapsed. No problem, said another doctor. We have checked her x-rays, and even though, yes, she does have a lung problem, her x-ray shows no collapse of any part of her lungs. In fact, she is fit and healthy. We are not worried about this operation. I stopped crying. No one had ever said no problem to me concerning an operation. Had God brought me all the way to America just to have my gallbladder removed? Now, I have letters from different doctors stating as a result of different tests that one of my lungs partially collapsed a few years ago. In fact, I went to see a consultant at Hammersmith only a couple of weeks ago, and there is my lungs, partially collapsed. I can see it. But now the doctors in America were saying that there was no sign of a partially collapsed lung. And yes, as a matter of routine, if I fly somewhere hot and the journey exceeds 5 hours, then I have to embark upon extensive exercises beforehand, and I have to take a regular dose of anti-inflammatories, which I normally do not do. And instead of my doctor giving me 1 week, which is all I'm required, they actually gave me 2. And so for 2 weeks, I walked twice a day. I walked twice a day. I swam every day. I used weights. I did everything I could to prepare for the flight, not knowing that God was preparing me for an operation. No wonder they said I was fit and healthy. And while I was trying to make sense of everything, Jonathan continued to share some other concerns regards the operation, and each time the answer he received was the same: no problem. Finally, the surgeon walked up to Jonathan, looked at him in his eyes, put his hand on his arm and said, "I hear your concerns. I understand. But I want you to know we can do this. We can do this." And they did. The operation was a success. The only complication was my heart rate, which began dropping after the operation, but they reckoned it was because I was allergic to a drug. And even that was covered beforehand, because every time the surgeon spoke to me before the operation, as a typical American, he kept asking God to bless my little heart. And guess what? The operation was carried out by a surgeon who worked at 5 different hospitals, and he just happened to be working at the hospital that I was taken to that Sabbath. And he wasn't just any surgeon. He had been voted top doctor by his peers. He is a fellow of the American Council of Surgeons, and he is most importantly, he is a partner of an institute in Texas from which surgeons all around the world go to learn how to do advanced laparoscopic procedures. That's what I had. The surgeon I had teaches other surgeons the best way to perform that operation. He educates surgeons, he trains them, he teaches them, he presents papers. And not only did God give me a surgeon that I normally would not have access to, but I didn't even have to pick up the bill. It was paid for by the insurance company. In the Bible, in 1 Peter, if I can get this thing right. Yeah. In 1 Peter 4, it says this: "Friends, when life gets really difficult, don't jump to the conclusion that God isn't on the job." It's so easy, isn't it, when we're hit with one problem after another, to think that God is doing nothing, that he has cold-shouldered us. But that's what the power of evil wants you to believe. God is always on the job, putting things in place to change a situation or to give us what we need to live with that situation. When I look back at everything that happened that week and during my recovery time, I was ashamed that I thought God was doing nothing when I prayed to him, because now I see that he was putting things in place to change that situation long before I saw that situation change. But God didn't just work behind the scenes to put things in place for the operation. He did more than that as well. Because when God acts, he does more than we can ask or think or dream or imagine. Because when I thought God was not on the job, he was putting together my own personal medical team. When I returned to the hotel after the operation, I was pretty frightened, because if I could mistake the pain of a gallbladder attack for an ankylosing spondylitis ache, then how would I know what pains were okay and which pains were not? 2 delegates at that GC were relatives of a family in Stanborough Park Church. And not only are those relatives both doctors, but one of them is a gallbladder surgeon. And a church member from Stanborough contacted these people and asked them to take care of me. And they would come and visit me every day, checking on me, dealing with my questions, dealing with my concerns. And when I returned back to England, a retired doctor from Stanborough Park Church would come and visit me every day to make sure I was okay. God had placed in my life my own personal medical team. And when I thought God was not on the job, he was putting together a prayer team for me. Because I responded so well to the operation, I was allowed to fly home 1 week earlier rather than waiting the 2 weeks, which was the normal thing, provided I agreed to walk as much as I could on the planes and also at the airports. But I was frightened to fly home. I felt very vulnerable. But God placed on those planes, particularly the second one, a retired Adventist nurse and several SDAs who kept telling me that they would be praying for me. And one lady in particular, she said to me, I stayed awake with you all night so that every time you were walking up the aisle, I was praying for you. God put these people in place even before I needed them. And when I thought God was not on the job, he gave me squeaky clean lungs. With my lung problem, I'm due to have chest infections, especially after an operation. But every time my lungs were examined, they were declared to be squeaky clean. And with my lungs, there's always should be a sound because of the problem that I have. And when I thought God was not on the job, he was putting together some expert advice. A year before we had gone to San Antonio, Jonathan had registered for a course at Newbold College, which he needed to go to. He needed to go there 1 week after we returned from the States. But he was worried about leaving me on my own because I couldn't do certain things. The college just gave Jonathan a double room free of charge and fed me so that I could stay there and he could look after me. And while I was there for the first week, there was a Romanian health director who showed me what exercises I could do until I could get into my exercise routine fully. Information that I had tried to get from my doctors, but I wasn't able to do it. And the second week, there was a GC health director there who spent time with me talking about the best way to recover from the gallbladder operation. And again, I never needed to pay for any of this expert advice. But the most amazing thing is, when I thought God was not on the job, he spoke to me through his word. Whenever I would worry about my gallstone, Jonathan would quietly repeat Psalm 23 to me, the song that we had before I started preaching. And in fact, throughout my whole time in the States, whenever I was scared, Jonathan would repeat that that psalm to me quietly. However, when I came home, I was worried that something was going to go wrong. I was worried I was going to get a chest infection. And this church member who came to visit me every day would listen very patiently to my fears. And one day, she turned up at our door, and she gave a pillowcase to us that she had embroidered to help me to trust God. And she told me that she didn't know what Bible verse to put on that pillowcase, and so she asked God. And he impressed her to put on it a shepherd with the words, Mary's shepherd is Jesus. I never told anyone, as far as I can remember, that Jonathan would recite Psalm 23 to me, and that was my strength when I was going through my difficulties. So I have come back from the States knowing more than ever how utterly amazing, how loving, how patient, how caring, how merciful, how compassionate God is. Because even when my faith in God was smaller than a mustard seed, even when I was too anxious to trust him, even when I was angry and resentful and struggled to worship him, even when I thought God was doing nothing, God, this merciful, amazing God, was quietly, carefully, thoughtfully putting things in place to change the situation that was causing me to doubt him. And even though I did not deserve all that God did for me, he did it anyway. And isn't that the story of Jesus and the cross? He does it for us anyway. And I have come back to England knowing how powerful God is. And that's why this week of prayer is so important. It's important that we come together, that we pray with one another, and that we acknowledge the greatness of God. And the fact that even though we go through those difficulties, God is still there. God is working those things through. Sometimes we kind of lose that. We forget how powerful God is, how loving, how compassionate He is. We get so focused on our difficulties and our struggles that we forget He is there to work through them for us, to work with us in them. And I wonder what would happen in our lives. We talked in Sabbath school about having that relationship with God. I wonder what would happen in our lives if actually we just spent more time on our knees in prayer, talking to God, giving Him everything, and asking for Him to work according to His plan, according to His ways. And I've learned something else from the States. God doesn't make mistakes in our lives. Even those things that cause us to fear and cause us to resent can be the very things that God will use to show us how much He loves us. Because God who worked the miracle, Jesus who worked the miracles in the Bible days, is the same Jesus who can work the miracles now. But that's my story. What about yours? Are you thinking, nice story, but that's not relevant to me. My life is fine. The chances are somewhere along the line, your life is not going to be fine. And you're going to need to hang on to this God. You're going to need to remember He is working behind the scenes. Remember that verse I shared with you? Friends, when life gets really difficult, don't jump to the conclusion that God isn't on the job. That's a verse I think that we all need to hang on to. We need to learn it. We need to memorize it. And we need to remember that no matter what goes on in our lives, God gave you higher priority than that of His Son. So there's no way He's going to let you down. And if God could take me all the way to America just to have my gallbladder removed, God has the power to deal with whatever you are facing. But don't be like me. Don't wait until you've got to breaking point when you surrender all and give everything to God and ask for Him to work. Do it now. Invite Him to make the final decision on what is best for you. And even though I've said God can do anything, there's nothing He cannot do. It doesn't mean that He is going to use His power in the way in which we always want. But it does mean that He'll always do what's right for us, what's best for Him, best for us. So invite Him to do so. And if God doesn't use His power to change those situations, ask Him to use that amazing out-of-this-world power to give you the courage and the strength and the hope until He does. A lovely thing that Ellen White writes here when we go through those stone-dead situations, where she says, "The Lord estimates every weight before He allows it to rest upon the hearts of those who are laborers together with Him. Jesus has borne sorrows and burdens, and He knows just what they are. He offers to lighten the loads we carry by putting Himself under the loads." Whatever difficulties you are going through, as I said, we are not meant to carry them on our own. Ask Jesus to put Himself under those loads and to carry them for you. So hang on to the fact that God is never not on the job. Trust Him, and the words of Psalm 40 will become yours too. And you will be able to say, "I waited and waited and waited for God. At last He looked, finally He listened. He lifted me out of the ditch, pulled me from deep mud to make sure I wouldn't slip. He taught me how to sing the latest God song, a praise song to our God." Hang on to God, because just as He rescued me, He will rescue you. He will lift you out of the ditch. He will pull you out of the mud. Just keep on inviting Him to deal with your stone-dead situation, and the day will come when you too will sing a praise song to God. Amen.